Okay, so strap in, everybody, because this time we're diving into some seriously thought-provoking stuff. We're tackling libertarianism, and specifically Murray Rothbard's For a New Liberty. This book, I gotta say, it's like the Bible for libertarians, the one that really lays out their core beliefs.
You're absolutely right. It's like the foundational text, the one you got to read if you want to wrap your head around what libertarians actually believe and how different it is from, well, pretty much everything we usually hear in politics and economics.
So not exactly light reading then, more like prepare to have your worldview rocked.
Yeah, you could say that. Rothbard takes us all the way back to the roots with classical liberalism, Locke, Jefferson, that whole emphasis on individual liberty as the ultimate goal.
Right, the big ideas that sparked revolutions, declarations of independence, the whole shebang. But Rothbard argues those revolutions didn't quite finish the job, did they?
Exactly. He points out that even after those revolutions, stuff like land monopolies and huge military buildups, they stuck around. Libertarians argue that the folks in power, those benefiting from the status quo, they're always going to resist giving up control, resist true individual freedom.
And that's where Rothbard throws us a real curveball, right?
Yeah.
He doesn't just want to tweak the system a little. He wants to flip the whole table over.
Exactly. He goes way beyond your typical classical liberals by saying the state, and I mean any state, is the main problem. Rothbard sees the state not as some neutral referee, but as the biggest threat to individual liberty.
Hold on. Not just a little overreach here and there, but public enemy number one. That's a pretty bold statement.
Yeah, and that's what makes libertarianism so different, so interesting. They don't look to the state for solutions. They see it as the root of the problem.
Yeah.
It puts them outside that whole left-right spectrum, almost like they're playing a different game entirely.
I can see that. So if anyone listening has ever felt like that left-right thing just doesn't quite fit, like there's a whole other dimension missing, well, this is why Rothbard's ideas resonate with so many.
Totally. And starting from this really radical idea that the state is the main aggressor, Rothbard builds his whole argument for a totally different kind of society.
Which leads us to the bedrock of libertarianism, the concept of natural rights.
Right. This isn't about some privileges that governments give us out of the goodness of their hearts. Libertarians are talking about rights that we inherently have simply by being human.
Okay, now, I know what some folks are thinking natural rights sounds a little, I don't know, theoretical. How does that work in the real world?
It's a good question, for sure. Think of it like this. Imagine you're an artist and you pour your heart and soul into creating this amazing sculpture. Who owns that sculpture? It's yours. You created it.
Makes sense. I put in the work, so it's mine.
Right. And libertarians believe that applies to all property. It's an extension of your work, your effort, who you are. And Rothbard takes this even further when he talks about land ownership. He questions how someone can claim to own a piece of land they've never even seen, especially when someone else has lived on it, worked on it, made it productive.
So if I were to, say, find a wild horse and spend years training it, it becomes mine. But if someone just comes along and slaps a property the crown sign on it, that doesn't automatically make it theirs.
Perfect analogy. Rothbard uses the example of someone gathering acorns versus someone who claims they own the whole forest. He argues that ownership has to be about more than just saying, this is mine.
Okay, I'm starting to see how this whole natural rights thing is like the foundation of libertarianism. It's the lens they see everything through.
Exactly. It shapes their views on pretty much everything: taxes, education, welfare, even war.
And we got to talk about all those things. Because when it comes to challenging the status quo, Rothbard doesn't hold back. He takes on what he calls the myths that the state uses to maintain its power.
And he's not talking about, myths like unicorns and dragons here. He's talking about these deeply ingrained beliefs that we've all come to accept as, well, just the way things are, without ever really questioning them.
Okay, I like where this is going. Hit me with an example. What's one of these myths Rothbard wants to bust wide open?
Let's talk taxes. Everybody's favorite subject, right? Rothbard doesn't mince words here. He straight up compares taxation to theft.
Oh, hold on a second. Theft. That's a strong word, isn't it? How does he get to that comparison?
He makes you look at the difference, or really the lack of difference, between what we call taxation and straight-up robbery. If someone demands your money under threat of force, is it really any different just because they slap a government label on it? That's what he wants us to think about.
Okay, yeah, I see what you mean. That's a question a lot of people probably don't ask themselves very often. It definitely challenges how most of us think about government and, well, our own rights.
Exactly. And it leads right into another area where Rothbard sees the state overstepping its bounds. education. Specifically, he's talking about compulsory public education. He sees it as a way to control people, not to liberate them.
Control. Really?
Right.
Those people see education as a good thing, empowering, right? Not as some tool for control.
Think about it this way. What if the government told us we were only allowed to read certain newspapers? That they got to decide which ones were okay and shut down all the rest? We'd call that censorship, wouldn't we?
Of course, without a doubt. That would be a blatant attack on freedom of the press.
Exactly. And Rothbard's point is that compulsory education, it's operating on a similar principle. It limits the choices that families have, it dictates what kids are learning, and it can really stifle intellectual diversity. Everyone's getting pushed towards the same narrow viewpoint.
Instead of having all these different perspectives, different approaches, everyone's stuck with whatever curriculum the state decides on.
Exactly. And then we come to another always contentious topic, welfare. But before we jump in, it's important to remember that Rothbard's critique isn't about being uncaring towards those in need. He's not saying we shouldn't help people who are struggling.
So this isn't about just saying, too tough, pull yourself up by your bootstraps.
Not at all. His concern is with how the welfare system, as it exists now, can trap people in a cycle of poverty. He thinks it can actually end up hurting the very people it's supposed to be helping.
Okay, so what's the alternative then? How do we help those in need in a way that actually empowers them and doesn't create these unintended consequences?
Rothbard was a big believer in voluntary charity. He argued that when individuals and private organizations choose to help others freely, it creates a much stronger sense of community. And it empowers both the people giving and the people receiving help.
It's about people helping each other out of compassion, not because some government program is forcing them to, which really fits with that whole libertarian emphasis on individual liberty, right?
Exactly. So we've got taxes, education, welfare. Rothbard wants us to really examine these things we often take for granted and see how they line up with individual freedom. But he doesn't stop there. He goes on to take on how governments manage, or in his view, mismanage the economy.
And this is where it gets interesting, even for folks who aren't, economics majors. But Rothbard, he had a way of connecting economic theory to everyday life, didn't he?
Totally. Like when he talks about inflation, that feeling we all know of prices going up faster than our paychecks, he doesn't blame greedy businesses for this. He points the finger right at governments and how they meddle with the money supply.
So instead of businesses being the bad guys, it's the government printing too much money, devaluing what's already out there, and that's what makes prices skyrocket.
That's what he argued. And this isn't some crazy fringe theory either. Rothbard was a big proponent of something called the Austrian School of Economics, and they've got some pretty solid arguments, even if they haven't always been in the mainstream.
Wait, back up a sec. The Austrian School of Economics. For folks who might not be familiar, can you break that down a bit?
Sure thing. The Austrian school, they're different from most mainstream economists. They're all about individual choice, saying government should butt out of the economy as much as possible. They focus on how unpredictable things are, how important time is when making decisions. One of their guys, Friedrich Hayek, he even won a Nobel Prize, brought their ideas back into the spotlight.
So it's not like Rothbard was out there on his own. He's got this whole school of thought, some real heavy hitters backing him up.
Exactly. And then Rothbard takes things even further with an argument that's radical even for some free market people. He says those essential services, the ones we usually think of as the government's job, police, courts, even roads, they could actually be provided by the free market.
Hold on, are we talking like private police forces?
Yes.
Whole roads for every stretch of pavement. That sounds a little, well, chaotic.
It's definitely a radical shift, no question. But Rothbard's point is that competition, that free market drive to do things better and cheaper, it would lead to higher quality services that are more responsive to what people actually want. He really thought private companies would have a strong incentive to provide great service to attract customers, which would be a win-win for everyone.
So instead of this one-size-fits-all approach from the government, you have choices, a whole marketplace of options, like we have now with different phone companies or internet providers.
Exactly. It all goes back to empowering individuals, giving them the freedom to choose what works best for them. And if a company's not cutting it, well, you take your business elsewhere. That's the beauty of the free market, at least in theory.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here, challenging assumptions about taxes, education, even imagining a world with private police forces. But we can't talk about Rothbard without tackling a topic that's, well, kind of central to his whole libertarian worldview.
Right, and this is where libertarianism really breaks from the mold. They see war, any war, as fundamentally illegitimate, as aggression driven by states. not by the needs or the will of actual individuals.
So are they saying that in a perfect libertarian world, there would be no war at all? That's a pretty different picture from how most people think about international relations and global politics.
For sure. I mean, they do recognize that sometimes you need to defend yourself, that violence isn't always avoidable, but they're deeply suspicious of wars waged by states, which they see as inherently coercive, using individuals as pawns in their power games.
It reminds me of that quote, war is the health of the state. Libertarians would probably say that's the perfect example of the state going way too far, totally trampling on individual liberty.
Absolutely. And they often point to historical figures who had similar doubts about war. Like, remember earlier when we mentioned Joseph Kennedy, that speech he gave back in 1951, where he criticized that whole Cold War mentality, arguing for a less interventionist foreign policy? That actually lines up pretty well with libertarian thought.
It's not every day you see a Kennedy and a hardcore libertarian like Rothbard on the same page.
You
But
know.
Kennedy made an interesting point in that speech. He said that a country that's less gung-ho about military might actually be less likely to get attacked. How does that work? Isn't a strong military supposed to, keep other countries from messing with you?
It does seem counterintuitive, right? But Kennedy, and libertarians would agree, would say that without this big, powerful state looming in the background, individuals wouldn't be seen as like extensions of that state. If the people in a country aren't seen as just tools of their government's foreign policy, then there's less incentive to attack them. It really challenges that whole idea of using military force to get what you want in the world.
So it's like saying, hey, don't lump us in with our government. We're not interested in being pawns in your power games. That's definitely a different way of looking at things.
Yeah, for sure. And it all comes back to that core libertarian principle, individual liberty. But let's be real, convincing people to completely rethink how they see government, that's a tall order. So how did Rothbard think we could actually get to this libertarian ideal? Did he have some kind of roadmap, a plan for getting from where we are now to this stateless society he envisioned?
The million-dollar question.
Yeah.
I mean, he called his book For a New Liberty, so he's clearly aiming for some major changes. Was he talking about violent revolution? Or maybe some gradual piece-by-piece dismantling of the system? What was his strategy?
He actually rejected both of those approaches. Violence, to Rothbard, that completely contradicted libertarian principles. And gradualism, he thought that usually just leads to compromises, to basically maintaining the way things are, just with a new coat of paint.
So no storming the Bastille, no waiting around for some magical policy change to create this libertarian utopia. What was his solution then?
He put his faith in the power of ideas. Rothbard, he really believed that the best way to make big changes is to just lay out a clear, compelling vision of a better way. He'd often compare it to how socialist thinkers, even though their ideas are totally different, they gained influence by painting this picture, maybe a flawed one, of their ideal society.
So less about political maneuvering, protests, all that, and more about winning hearts and minds, convincing people that another way of life is possible, a freer way.
Exactly. He believed that if you show people the flaws in the current system and offer a real alternative, a logically sound one, then more and more people would start to question their assumptions and say, hey, maybe this individual liberty thing isn't so crazy after all.
It's a long game, that's for sure. But Rothbard wasn't exactly known for shying away from bold ideas. Did he ever say, what event or moment he thought could be a turning point for this shift towards libertarianism?
He did, and you might be surprised. He pointed to Watergate.
Watergate. Really? That doesn't exactly scream individual liberty and limited government.
True. Watergate itself wasn't about pushing libertarian ideas, but Rothbard saw something else in it, something really significant. He saw how that scandal and the way it just destroyed people's trust in government, that it created a unique opportunity. He figured when people lose faith in the institutions they used to believe in, well, they become a lot more open to radical ideas.
It's like that moment when you realize the system you thought you understood, the one you bought into, it's broken. And then suddenly those alternatives that seemed impossible, they start to look a little more appealing.
Exactly. Rothbard saw Watergate as this crack in the foundation of authority. And he believed that crack could be widened by offering a compelling alternative. A future where individual liberty is the top priority and the state's power is seriously curtailed.
So where does that leave us? Can a truly stateless society, a world without taxes or government-run schools or even a standing army, can it actually work? Or is this whole idea of libertarianism, the way Rothbard described it, it's just a utopian dream? An interesting thought experiment, but not something that could ever exist in the real world.
That's the question Rothbard leaves us wrestling with. He doesn't claim to have all the answers, but he definitely makes you think about some fundamental stuff like, what is freedom, really? What's the proper role of the state? And what kind of world do we want to live in?
For A New Liberty, it's more than just a political book. It's a challenge. It makes you confront your own beliefs about power, about liberty, about how individuals and the state should interact.
And in a world where it's easy to just accept things the way they are, Rothbard's willingness to question everything, to think deeply and critically about the world around him, that's maybe his most important contribution.
So there you have it, our deep dive into Murray Rothbard's For a New Liberty. It's not an easy read, but it's one that'll stick with you. It might even make you see the world and the role of government in a whole new light. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive, and we'll catch you next time.